Good afternoon and good morning to those of you on the West Coast. My name is Bill Potter. I'll be your moderator today for this Nuix webinar on Microsoft Office 365 Discovery. My role at Nuix, I'm a commercial account manager. I work with our large enterprise clients who are managing cost and risk through analysis of electronically stored information. And usually that manifests in eDiscovery, compliance, surveillance, and investigations. Today we have a really great opportunity to hear from Michael Lappin, who's a director of our corporate sales engineering team, and until recently led up the Nuix email migration team. He's going to be talking to us a little bit about a really interesting challenge that companies are facing as they move from on-premise email platforms into cloud email platforms, particularly Microsoft Office 365. Michael's a great person to talk to us about this because he has over 16 years of work in the litigation support technical space, both at major law firms and delivering email archive platforms to corporations. Until recently, Michael led a really interesting program here at Nuix, the email migration platform. It's a really exciting project that we've been doing a lot of work on. He's going to talk to us a little bit specifically about the partnership that we have with Microsoft Office 365 and the work that we do to help companies control the cost and risk of discovering messages that are stored in a cloud environment. Michael, how are you today?
Yeah, doing good. Thanks, Bill.
Wonderful. Thank you. Michael, is there any detail from your background that you think is particularly relevant to the discussion of eDiscovery in the cloud of messages stored in Office 365?
Yeah, I think having to deal with these email archives and migrations between them and to Office 365, moving data out of Exchange platforms into archives, back out of the archives, back up into the cloud or wherever. Considering the sheer volumes of data that are often considered to be moved by our customers, it's important to have quite a bit of history there, and a couple of my teammates also have a lot of that history. So I think that gives us a good, reasonable, maybe rational background for explaining some of the things we're going to do today. We've sort of perfected the approach, I believe, and we also realize there are some pitfalls in exploring this kind of move to the cloud, and so we're going to explore those today.
Wonderful. And your background includes a significant time spent working with a law firm. Do you find that that has informed your understanding of the right technical approach to these sorts of challenges?
Yeah, it's funny because there's so many, not only the law firms, but the legal departments of our Fortune-type customers that don't understand, the momentous sort of gigantic undertaking it is to move billions of emails to the cloud. So, I find myself, and my teammates also find themselves spending a lot of time doing the education thing, on the road, trying to tell people how it's really done, what is possible, what is impossible, and how long it takes to achieve some of those goals.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned that because I know our focus today is on eDiscovery, but it's important to consider why companies are moving into a cloud email environment. The role that plays in facilitating business in a global mobile knowledge environment, and the important role that legalists play in helping companies navigate that risk, both across multiple international jurisdictions, expectations around preservation, and then realistically considering that some of that information is going to be turned over to regulators or the courts due to legal action.
Right.
So one of the things that we'll try and do today, in addition to talking about the technical aspect of how Nuix partnerships with Microsoft Office 365, we'll also talk about some of the business considerations and workflow considerations from a legalist perspective. Though neither Michael and I are attorneys, it is important to consider navigating those hurdles. Michael, so you're particularly interested in this topic of Office 365. What's your experience been? What's driving people to move into an Office 365 in the cloud environment? What's the business justification there?
Well, a lot of it is the hands-off management capability of the cloud, which is generically what people like to talk about when they talk about the cloud. Let's get things off of our servers, off of our storage. Let's make it so that our people don't have to manage and maintain it and keep it up and running and back it up. So that basic stuff still absolutely plays here, but there is quite a bit of good salesmanship and good product development by the Microsoft people. So they're making a very, very usable solution for both end users and for the IT departments to keep happy, and believe it or not, even for the legal department, for the most part, to take part in using Microsoft tools to do things that they've had to struggle with over the years using, these on-premise archives, as well as other, third-party type eDiscovery tools. So they're finding a lot of use there from, an eDiscovery perspective, all the way down to the end user who finds it quite easy to log into an Outlook web access rather than Outlook on-premise interface and do what they always do with the world's leading, Outlook mail client. So it's all those things wrapped up together, and Microsoft has really taken that market really by the horns. And so we've been on a wild ride with them now. We work pretty closely with Microsoft Global Delivery around the world to help them not take the migration less than seriously. We're working heavily with Microsoft so that they can include the migration in their conversation. Take the problem or the challenge of the migration off the table by using Nuix technology to get customers where they need to go, and also reduce entry barriers around eDiscovery. And we'll see that today in the demonstration where Nuix can come in and augment what Office 365 eDiscovery offers today.
Thank you. With that in mind, just to outline a little bit of what we hope to cover today, we'll talk through journal mailboxes and the explosion of data there using a specific project that Michael helped support here at Nuix that really highlights both the value and some of the challenges that can go with the transition from an on-site email storage environment to a cloud environment. We'll also talk about some statistics that we think are indicative of the direction that this particular market space is going. We'll compare Office 365's native eDiscovery capabilities with some of the features that are available in Nuix, and just sort of talk through the different workflows they support and scenarios where one might shine versus scenarios where the other shines. And then we'll talk a little bit about using collections through Nuix, and finally ask Michael to give us a demonstration of what the technology looks like and how it functions from the user perspective. So, Michael, I'd maybe like to start by talking specifically about the scenario that you completed recently. Over 100 terabytes of email that was moved from one archive into Office 365. That's a huge amount of data. Can you talk to us a little bit about what the company was trying to accomplish from that migration?
Well, yeah, they were trying to move this, what they call an email journal, from one archive into the cloud in Office 365. And unfortunately, right now, Microsoft doesn't offer a journal in the cloud. Now, we all know that journaling in Microsoft Exchange, and Lotus Notes for that matter, has been around for years, and it's been a very interesting and very valuable proposition to most companies. It allows for every bit of email from anyone, sent or received, to be placed into a single mailbox. And then that can then in turn be cleaned out by an archiving platform to move that data into a single indexed repository. Sounds great, right? And it really is. It really is a fantastic way to ensure some easy roads to good compliance, as well as good eDiscovery citizenship as well. So this is something that's been around, has been very, very popular. A lot of the people at Nuix who are archive geeks like myself have seen the adoption of journaling across all of the continents and all of the different verticals and around the world. Now, what this company wanted to do, they're a huge global pharmaceutical. We've all heard of them. I wrote a little blog case study here that you can check out, and it talks about how 100 terabytes of compressed and what we call single instance archive material is a lot of email. We're talking that's easily 1 billion emails, probably more. And it explodes. So when you take it out of that format, of course, this compression and single instancing is going to go away. So it's going to be, if you call it reduplicated, or if you want to call it fanned out, whatever words you want to use, that 100 terabytes became quite a bit more than 100 terabytes. We've seen journals expand, and believe it or not, we've seen figures of 12x. So, we've seen some massive sort of exposure customers that say, oh boy, that's a bigger job than I thought. So we have to sort of reconsider the commercial viability of doing that. This particular customer, their goal was, let's move it all up there because we want to have the journal intact. But like I said, there was no journal product in the cloud yet. It's coming. But what we did is we were able to explode this out into the individual custodians. So we were able to then place this email back into a place in the Office 365 mailbox that the client could not see it. It's called recoverable items. And we're going to get into that architecture a little bit when we dive into the technical weeds a bit. But the idea is we could spread that data back out and place it back into mailboxes so that the journal value proposition was maintained for this particular customer. Now, I think what we're going to do today is use this as an example of maybe things that are not necessarily advisable. Maybe these aren't the right things to do, and for many customers, they aren't. It isn't the right thing to do to move 1 billion email messages. Maybe it's only safe to move 1 year. So that's something we'll talk about is the qualified intelligent migration where we consider the realities of, if you will, the mess that we made with our previous archive.
Well, and I think that that's an important point that you highlight there, because on one hand, you might be dealing with significantly more data than your metrics suggest going into it. But on the flip side, you might actually be able to migrate less than the complete environment in order to satisfy your legal obligations. Most of these companies have archives going back 10, 15 years. That's a lot of information. A lot of that is not necessarily subject to record retention and legal retention obligations. So Michael, maybe we can talk for a second about sort of broad cloud trends and the challenges that it creates from a governance perspective, but also particularly in the eDiscovery space. What's different about eDiscovery from a cloud email archive than from a traditional on-premise archive? How are those two things functionally different?
Well, I mean, there is a certain level of fear and certainty, right? Because your data now is not your own. It has escaped. It's into the cloud. Can we get it back? What kind of SLA, service level agreements, do we have to reobtain our data and produce it for legal reasons? That's always been something that has frightened many customers. But I can tell you that in the last year, a lot of that fear has been set aside due to the overwhelming benefits of moving things up there, and of course the increased capability of particularly the Microsoft eDiscovery Compliance Center, and then of course things like Nuix that can augment processing cloud data and doing the early case assessment and all the wonderful things that Nuix can do with data in the cloud. But generally speaking, that fear is one thing, but now it's sort of progressed into, can I do the robust eDiscovery operations that I want to do? Another trend that we see, which is great for me because I'm selling into the commercial or the corporate space, is we see more and more companies who want to in-house a lot of their eDiscovery practice. So they're actually bringing in things like Nuix and doing it themselves, if you will. So having an answer to that going along with the cloud is also really important. And you can see on the screen, I collected more than a dozen surveys about the cloud, and the top 3 things included eDiscovery. Surprisingly, it was right up there. I mean, security, of course, is number 1. Governing the data, controlling it is number 2, but then the eDiscovery interest, how do our legal and risk teams get the data in front of them they need to see, and how do they produce it in a timely manner?
Yeah, I think that's particularly important when you think about the global cloud storage environment, or at least the cross-jurisdictional nature. For companies that do business in one region, maybe their data is being stored in another region, and being able to think about that intelligently and make good risk decisions, I think, is an important one. So what's your experience? You've done a number of these projects. Where's the data coming from, and why are companies selecting Office 365 as their end location for their email? Why is that the place they're moving to?
Yeah, I mean, the data is coming from the big 4, as we call them, which is Enterprise Vault, about 20,000 customers, Autonomy EAS, EMC Source One, and EMC Email Extender, and then a variety of other smaller niche players like Access One and Guava and a few others. We're talking, like you said, about 10 to 15 years of archiving. We're talking about trillions of email messages across the globe. And almost everybody in the Fortune 500 space has adopted at least some form of email archiving, if not more than one platform. And of course, mergers and acquisitions has something to do with that. We're also seeing older Microsoft Exchange versions being migrated up to Office 365, again, for those same cloud, reasonable reason, rationale. We're finding that almost every destination is Office 365. You'll see about 80% of what we've done tends to end there rather than other on-premise archives. So those are slowly becoming dinosaurs, which is hard to believe given how fast and furious the sales were of those on-premise archive platforms just 5, 6, 7 years ago. I was traveling every week and doing hundreds of demos a month for the Enterprise Vault product, and it was adopted well. We do see quite a few customers who have used other cloud destinations like Proofpoint and Mimecast, which are both very, very powerful because they do maintain the excellence around compliance and eDiscovery. They have amazing SLAs. So they have been pretty successful, and we've partnered with them as well. And then that journaling piece that Office 365 doesn't offer is one of the only real inhibitors that I see that's keeping more customers still shying away just a little bit, despite our ability to do that journal explosion, whether it's advisable or not. So a lot of data moving is the story, Bill. A lot of data moving from one place to the other. But I guess we urge caution and intelligence when doing so that you end up doing this thing right and not spending a lot of time and money moving data that might be fairly useless because it has been in that archive for 10 years.
So, we talked a little bit about the migration process and companies deciding to move from a legacy environment into Office 365. Michael, could you talk to us a little bit about once they're in Office 365, what are some of the discovery features that they can expect to encounter and the scenarios where those features are satisfactory and help them manage kind of risk as well as cost?
Yeah, these features that they have now in Compliance Center are very much sort of on par with what we've seen in the development of email platforms as well as email archive platforms. They give you the basics, and they give you some decent scalability. The Compliance Center is fairly good at being fairly fast. We love fast at Nuix, of course. That's our favorite word. And what I've seen in demonstrations recently at some of the Microsoft conferences are your basic Boolean type search capabilities. You got your keywords, your phrases, your ands, your ors, your nots, some of that good stuff that we all expect here in the eDiscovery world. The ability to produce to PST. Some permissions granularity, I think, is very, very important. So role-based access seems to be of an important, high level of importance for the Microsoft people in their design. And then they've got some nice things around search time estimates, statistical analysis and reporting. So just very, very good basic stuff. And it seems to me, what I've seen, it's been very reliable. So in other words, when a lawyer or a paralegal steps up to the plate to run a search, they tend to get good results. They're accurate. They don't fluctuate, which is, of course, very, very important. It has been a concern over the years if you know you're archiving. So, the basics are there. So some of those smaller cases, those HR investigation type cases tend to go very well. Small, easily repeatable workflows tend to be very, very acceptable in the Compliance Center.
So how is that different from the Nuix approach? If Microsoft Compliance Center can deliver on kind of core functionality for routine cases, what instances is it right to bring in Nuix to augment that, and why?
Well, the robustness of the Nuix platform is pretty well world-renowned by now, right? Nuix has been around for more than 15 years and continues to expand its eDiscovery capabilities. So all of those unique, more robust features that you might need, like some of the ones listed on the screen, like good old proximity searching and very aggressive dedupe capabilities, automatic classification, technology-assisted review, web review, some of the things I'll show you here in just a few minutes that give you a bigger picture, a faster picture. Of course, we have a patent around our scalability and things like that, and we can do this in concert with the Microsoft Cloud and even on-premise tools because they have a very, very robust API that we can go into and use as sort of the front door into the data so that we can effectively augment Microsoft Office 365 users when they need that extra push for timeliness, for precision and accuracy, and then for just feature set. And then, of course, we have probably a more complete vision when it comes to the end-to-end eDiscovery compliance, content, incident response, as well as cybersecurity capabilities. So we take it to maybe the nth degree.
Now let's talk about a particularly scary scenario for a lot of corporate legal departments. You get a case that you think is a routine case, you think it's manageable through you sort of as a smaller case, it's not kind of bet the company, but then you learn something halfway through, something changes, maybe it goes class action, maybe you find something that does indicate culpability, and it moves from being a routine case to something that poses real legal risk to the company. How well does Nuix and the Microsoft Compliance Center, how well do we work together for companies that are trying to transition a case from routine workflow into a more elevated and advanced workflow?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So when we see case scrutiny changing, when we see cases evolving, we tend to be front and center in those kind of situations. We are very open with our Microsoft partners and customers about how we can be, a reducer of barriers to not only entering into the cloud, but also assuring a customer that if their cases do become too big or too heavily scrutinized, or we may see things like criminal implication, we may see more distribution of data into various countries, as you mentioned, where we see different kinds of data other than the Office 365 SharePoint data and, of course, email data. When we see things spanning other types of repositories so that a Nuix solution could be deployed to federate that experience from an eDiscovery standpoint. In other words, let's deduplicate everything, not just what's in the cloud, but everything on our internal file systems, or perhaps from that old archive that we left behind some data. Nuix is in a great position to do that federation in a very robust and very high-speed standpoint.
So let's talk a little bit about the back end, both from a cloud perspective and just the functionality of archiving. Can you help us understand why this is a complex question that does require sort of unique approach?
So that's a great question. One of the things we've seen over the years is that a lot of these archives and email platforms were developed and deployed with the intention by customers to really impact their data lifecycle management with retention schedules. So in other words, let's just retain as much as we need to for as long as we need to. Inevitably, however, that never really took place. And I have a funny story where I tried to write a white paper about retention trends, and what I came up with is that everybody was hanging on to everything. So the feasibility of doing migrations and moving every single thing starts to become hard to manage, hard to discuss, even though it is probably 8 or 9 out of 10 customers' desire. So I guess what we've learned is to try to counsel the customers a little bit on realities and about time frames, and realize that data is still moving data, right? And it is going to take you a while, no matter how fast Nuix is, or no matter how fast Office 365's API is. So we find ourselves considering quite a bit of several other options that might serve the customer better. When they look at that journal explosion, for instance, do you really want to do that? And often when we do some data sampling and some assessments, they start to reconsider both the commercial and the eDiscovery, legal implications of doing that.
So talk to us a little bit about this concept you have here of migrating to nowhere. What are the scenarios in which it might be advisable to leave a portion of your legacy data out of your new archive environment?
Yeah, we love to give customers as many choices as we can, right? But I think generally speaking, our tone is fairly prescriptive when we talk to customers about the realities of these explosions, these archive migrations that could take a year, even with a stack of Nuix servers with all the scalability. So what we try to talk to customers about is a couple of balancing a few things. The user experience. What does the user really need to have in Office 365? What do they really need to have access to on a daily or even weekly, monthly basis? Is there some reasonable retention that we could execute on now? So during the migration, can we finally go ahead and implement a retention schedule or a retention practice that we've wanted to for 10 or more years? And then we also have to look at the commercial feasibility. How much is it going to cost you to get that data up there and store that data and manage it in the cloud? Do you want customers or the end users to have access to it? How much? In a journal, usually the answer is no. Would you rather leave it there and have Nuix process that data where it lives, whether it's in the archive or Exchange or Lotus Notes, and get a really nice index on it so that not only can IT be pretty reactive to getting users back their data when they need to, but they'll also be able to do the eDiscovery. They'll be able to execute some great searches, as we've expressed. We'll be able to export data locally and quickly to a load file format for downstream review and things like that. And we try to help them weigh the different options and think about how they might balance that. And I think we're seeing more and more customers at least strongly consider leaving behind something. And it generally points to a date range. Sometimes it's users or former users. Sometimes it's specific teams that need to move or not move. But it usually has something to do with a rational and reasonable, defensible retention schedule, knowing full well that the data will be still in place if need be with a Nuix index on it, so that perhaps some of the support and maintenance support and maintenance contracts that the customer has may not be required. So there's lots of places to look for ROI by not moving things, and that's what we try to educate the customers about.
Well, you'd mentioned a couple slides earlier that one of the drivers of moving into a consolidated cloud environment is a lot of our large companies have grown through acquisition of the past 15 or 20 years, and a consequence of that is a sort of amalgamation of email archiving platforms, company 1, company 2, company 3. And those scenarios really do bring up complex situations where what data are we legally obligated to hold on to and for who, particularly if the acquisition was tied to workforce changes as well. I think that it's helpful if you can give them the option to move business relevant information into an updated environment and then maintain stuff that's potentially responsive to legal questions in sort of a temporary stage in the Nuix case, so that it's easy to search for. You can pull that data out quickly when it's necessary, but you don't have it. You don't have to worry about managing it as part of your infrastructure going forward. It's a lot easier to close down a Nuix case than it is an archive. So it's interesting to link those two questions, particularly as the M&A market sparks up again today. So, Michael, can you talk us through a little bit about how Nuix actually works in our partnership with Office 365? Show us some of the technical detail.
Yeah, so guys, we're going to get into it a little bit here. We're going to get into a few technical details, and we'll just shortly get into a demonstration where we're actually going to move some data into and out of Office 365 for multiple use cases. But some of the things that distinguish us, and not only our track record of having to do this for so many customers and working with Microsoft Global Delivery, so our experience is always very valuable, but we've found that we've got a fine-tuned way to move mailboxes very quickly and scale that up by using Nuix, multiple instances of Nuix, what we call multiple instances, on multiple servers. And these servers can be cloud-based, and we'll talk about that. There are cloud-based Azure servers, which can be distributed within the same data center where the Office 365 data will eventually live physically. We also have some unique and powerful methods by which we can authenticate to these mailboxes so that we can write those folder structures that our users demand and also populate them, of course, with all of their old email and archived email. So we've got sort of 4 big things that we can do. It's the good old-fashioned Nuix speed and scalability, along with some clever things we've learned about the Exchange Web Services API. That's what we call it, EWS. And we've found that that's a pretty darn good API. It's pretty robust if you know what you're doing, and that's something we've learned to do. So hopefully I'll be able to distinguish this a little bit as we work through our demo. And so I'll get going on that. And we're going to come back to a few pictures during the demo because we've got to let the thing cook just a little bit. We're going to do some processing. We're going to do some extraction as well as a little bit of migration at the same time. So we'll talk about our use of impersonation quite a bit. I'll push some data into Office 365. We'll pull it right back out for eDiscovery. And then we'll talk about some of the nuts and bolts like binary stores and some of the Slack space and some of that geeky email stuff and forensic stuff that we need to address here, hopefully distinguishing Nuix just a little bit. So let's do that. I've got here an Azure server. Now, you guys don't know what an Azure server is. Azure is an offering from Microsoft that includes a variety of different virtual resources, including virtual servers, virtual SQL servers, virtual storage, and a variety of other neat utilities and applications. We find that this is one of the best ways to do a migration, is to move the data by a variety of methods, including a disk shipping, a drive shipping service, as well as using just some gateways to move data up to the cloud and position it there. What's neat about this Azure thing is we can use multiple, sometimes as many as 10 or 12 Azure servers connecting to multiple mailboxes and really scaling this out so we're populating more than 10 or 12 mailboxes at a time. Azure is very affordable. There's an online calculator where you can figure out how much it costs to do a migration and to stage data there and to do eDiscovery there too. So it's pretty neat to be able to work in the cloud, around the cloud, for eDiscovery and whatever use case you have. We can, at Nuix, we can tell you where your Office 365 data is headed. So a regional, what Microsoft calls them, regional data center, is where they're going to be, and they're often very close to your own data, your own data center. And then you can actually, we got a little script that'll allow us to populate these virtual servers to do the migration and eDiscovery in the same data center. And guess what that means? That means that we're going to go a lot faster, right, than going over a long, network pipeline. So I'm just going to go ahead and kick off a quick migration, guys. I'm just going to populate a mailbox. I've got a bunch of mailboxes here in Office 365 that I use. I'm going to start up Nuix here and get us going. I'll select a license. Now, if you know your Nuix licenses, there's a group of licenses that do actually support the targeting of email archives as well as Office 365. And the one that we usually talk about a lot is the Email Archive Examiner license. So keep that one in mind. So we're going to start on Nuix here and blow this guy up. Here's our workbench. Some of you probably know it pretty well. And I'll go ahead and kick off a single mailbox migration so we won't spend too much time. And that should come up for us in a second. I'm going to go ahead and select, it's going to be in here, and source data. So my Nuix platform actually has the ability to decide which user is going to be migrated. You saw there was a whole lot of archive material that I had extracted from an archive and placed into user-based PST files, as we discussed. But my victim today is one of my coworkers and friends, Jason Purcell. I've got his mailbox ready to go here. And we're going to populate his mailbox. So that's going to start going out. It's not real large. It's going to be taking about 3 minutes. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to let that cook, and then we're going to tap dance just a little bit here and show you a couple more pictures that I want to show you to expand upon just a little bit of what this architecture really looks like. First of all, I want to talk about the Exchange Web Services interface itself. This API is very robust. It does have some throttling associated with it. So we've, at Nuix, we're always trying to figure a way to just fill the pipes with data as fast as we can, whether we're processing or we're exporting, whatever we're doing. And we've really spent a lot of time doing that. You use the traditional web services API address to get started, and we'll use that in a moment here when we actually start to extract data back out. And then we like to use application impersonation rather than what they call delegate access. Now, application impersonation is one of the little secrets that we have where we can actually start those multiple instances of Nuix on the same Azure server or regular server behind the firewall. And then imagine this exponentially by having 10 of those. And then we can start somewhere between 4 and 8 instances. And then Exchange Web Services allows us, using an application impersonation admin account, to then open multiple mailboxes from the same server. So can you imagine 8 mailboxes being populated on 10 Azure servers? You're talking about 80 mailboxes being populated at the same time. So I know it's a little bit of a mind puzzle there, just to figure out how much that really means. But what you're talking about is, eventually with doing this right, we're talking about a mailbox an hour, maybe a mailbox every hour and a half if we do this right. And that's talking about customers that have users with 120,000, 140,000 messages in that range right there. So that makes it very useful. Delegate access is not quite as good because you just get that single connection per virtual server or server that's doing the migration. Delegate access is powerful. It's great because it allows you to read and write to the mailbox, which is what you need to do. Make folders, fill them with email. So it allows you that level of administration that we want without overstepping that or having to manage 1,000 users' passwords by using user account authentication. So impersonation is really the way to do this. And it's real simple, guys. I'll just show you, geek out pretty heavily here for 1 second. We've just got some easy PowerShell commands that we run these, and we just allows us to grant, and I'll show you this in Office 365, to grant permissions to a specific account to a group of mailboxes. And that could be 100 mailboxes, it could be 1,000 mailboxes. And that's another way to control how we defensively move data into and out of Office 365, because we can contain sort of the security around who has access with what account to do that work. Well, let's check in here. Looks like we're done. What are we up? 2 minutes. That's pretty good. Record speed here. Okay, so I'll just go over to the mailbox here. I should have done this. I didn't expect it to be done so soon. Now, what you see here in the inbox is, I believe, we now have a legacy archive folder. Let me go ahead and refresh this here. We should see the legacy archive now. After refreshing, now we see the various folders that our individual user has, and then you see there's his email. So just to sort of recap, guys, it came out of an archive. We moved it to Azure. We could use SFTP to do that. We could use the drive shipping capabilities from Microsoft, a variety of different ways to do this. But what it does give you is about 3 times the speed for an Azure server as opposed to one behind the firewall at the customer's site. Now, a very small migration, it sometimes works just fine to put a Nuix server behind the scenes. But in many cases, using the cloud servers is the way to go. Okay, so we've got our mailbox populated now. So we successfully moved the archive data along with the live email. Before I start pulling the data out, let's talk just a little bit about that impersonation setting here. You see, I've got a group of mailboxes, some of my coworkers here, and then I've got this one application impersonation account. So that's the account I made my active users, and then I applied those permissions with that little script in PowerShell. So it's very easy to do. It took me about 10 minutes to get this all up and running, so that now not only can I populate those mailboxes, but now I can shift us to the next phase of this data's life cycle, which is it's moving into an eDiscovery scenario. So what I need to do now is let me go ahead and shut down Nuix and restart it here real quick. And while I'm doing that, I'll take a look at some of the interesting reports we get. We do get a variety of metrics. We have a nice summary report that shows us what we did, how many messages went in. If we had any errors, we would have a little spreadsheet that would contain all those errors. Now, what errors do we normally see? We see a few. We'll see the top 2 are probably a throttling-based error because we were overloading the pipe, if you will, and that usually allows us to tune down some of our aggressive settings around how many mailboxes we want to connect to at one time. And then we also see some timeouts. Sometimes we'll see a message that's not going to get through because of size. There is a size limitation. I believe right now it sits at about 35 megs. That can be increased by requesting it through the Microsoft channel. They can actually increase that for you if you need to. And of course, we have some nice export guidelines here around our workers. We got errors per worker and things like that. So lots of nice, as expected, chain of custody and reporting that you would like to see. Okay, so now let's say that our migration is done, and let's restart Nuix and pick a license and then work through our eDiscovery workflow here, and it'll just take us a couple minutes. All right. So once we kick this off, we are going to go back and look at a couple of pictures around Mailbox Architecture that'll help us a lot. Okay, so we're selecting from our Nuix server, management server, an email archive examiner license. Now, you don't have a license for this. What we're going to do, a regular old eDiscovery workstation license will work. All right, so let's Let's go ahead and start up a case here. This extraction takes just a couple minutes as well. And what you'll normally see is the extraction from Office 365 tends to go a little bit faster. I'm not sure I know exactly why that is, but that's just the sort of what we've seen. I believe that most times the number of custodians that are being processed for eDiscovery is generally less than the thousands of users that we'll see in migration. That's probably part of it. And before I target an actual mailbox, I just want to show you two really important settings. If you know your Nuix case settings, there's two that are really important to us here. One that we'll discuss from both a legal and technology standpoint is the store binary option. This is where you can actually make a copy of the data and keep it local on this Azure server rather than leaving it up there in the cloud. I'm going to discuss why and when you would do that. And then another one here is the extract from mailbox /space. This is going to allow us to collect everything in that mailbox, which is the best practice. And don't worry, I'm going to give you some color on this in a moment. I just wanted to have you see this. So as usual, we'll just go on and add evidence. And the way we do this is we go out to a network location and we use EWS. Now this would work the same way for both Exchange on-premise or in the cloud as well. I'm going to go ahead and cut and paste some credentials in here real quick. Here's that good old ASMX address, which most of us in our world have memorized, which allows us to access Exchange Web Services. Let's grab that mailbox. Credentials here. We'll just do this real quick. And we'll explore that architecture. Okay, and then we got to get a password in here. Just like that, right? Okay, so you see here, we can actually, in the GUI, we can actually select if we want just the mailbox, the personal archive, which is another mailbox, or the purges folder. Okay, just hold the line. We're going to get into what that means and why it's important. These start dates and end dates are great when we're going back and we're doing those delta syncs, where we're going to go back and we're going to, re-scan that evidence repository so that we can grab the new stuff. So as the user may have created more data, we can actually grab that without having to, associate ourselves with all of the old messages we've already targeted. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to one that I processed previously for you, and so I can show you what I processed just a little while ago. So let's do that. So let's open this one here. This is one I processed, I believe it was yesterday, and show you what it looks like. Let's actually look at a slide real quickly here, and I want to show you what this mailbox looks like architecturally. I mentioned the purges, the inbox, and the recoverable items. You see that this doesn't even include here on the screen from a Microsoft Knowledge Base article the recoverable items and the personal archive. Personal archive is another mailbox. You see we've got inbox. We don't even show personal archives here, but we have recoverable items as a multifaceted part of the mailbox. There's things that users delete, things that have been placed on hold by the Compliance Center, as well as things that have been placed in purges. So we have the ability to place data in any of these places. And the best practice workflow is that we have to first measure the volatility of the data. If it is user data, not journal data that we've populated with the migration, if it is user data, we're going to make sure that we're going to take a binary copy of that. So that's where that binary setting comes in. We are going to make a copy of that because a user can interact with it and delete it and do things to it. We want to get a copy, to, have that point in time copy of that mailbox. So we're going to actually move a copy into the Azure Nuix server. If the data is not volatile, then you don't have to keep that binary because it's not going to change, and you can go back to the well and retrieve and export produced data as you require. So look at this and realize that this is very complex. Now, if I go back to my server with my pre-processed data, you have got this huge architecture here, including all items, which is in fact a duplicate of everything in the entire mailbox. So that's one place you can go potentially to get everything. And with Nuix in the pre-processing screen, you can deselect things you don't want to see. You also have, here is the recoverable items only area with all of those different folders in there. I think you'll see, if I crack this open, you'll see the purges and things like that, and the deletions. And then here's the good old top of information store, which is essentially what the user sees in the inbox. So we see all of this. And what's interesting here is that the deduplication of this data can be very important because you will see duplicates because of the way you can see here. All items in targeting that, I've actually duplicated some of my work, and I've actually been able to pare this down to about 428 emails rather than the total, which is close to 2,000. So again, using Nuix in the way it's designed to be used will allow you to deselect and filter on what you need to see. Now, what's sort of the next step here? Of course, you can do all of the workflow that you do within Workbench pretty easily. Of course, you can run your searches and start to folder some data for our different users. If we jump over to Nuix Web Review, now we can actually continue the story with the data still living in the cloud, whether it be in a binary copy on the Azure server or still in Office 365 or both. So if I've got one here, I've got a case that I can look at in Web Review. Now you have the data staying in place and using the value proposition of Nuix Web Review and Analytics, where we can come in and start to mark, tag, annotate the data, and look at these interesting analytics graph. So we can actually go into our grid, and we can, let's see if I can find, let's do a search. Let's do a search in here, and maybe we'll bring up some good old Enron email. So then you can start to use Web Review as it's designed, and we have our various tagging structures here. We can put our comments in, look at an abbreviated form of the metadata at hand here. So Web Review can continue the conversation and allowing us to do review without having to move the data out of the cloud. So again, that flexibility of federating some of that for the customers. And then finally, when we see, as we inevitably do, when we see the expansion and scope of this case, so we grabbed one mailbox there. What if it's, the custodian list inevitably always is increased and grows to thousands of custodians potentially? Well, you can use Nuix Director, which is what we're looking at right here, to help you easily expand that. Because as you work through the perfect workflow, I like to call it, you've processed the data, you've got your Nuix index now, and then you're going to start to search and tag and deal with exceptions, handle the export formats, and start to move data out of the cloud. You can replicate that without any human error using Nuix Director and the template concept. This is a case that I already did where I pulled it on the mailbox and out of the cloud using the Nuix Director. And what you can see here is if we go to our templates, this is what you use for that saved workflow. So you take a case, you name it, and you bring in a workflow, then you point it at something, including a number of additional mailboxes. And if I just go into one of these, just to quickly show you, you can actually see that in these processing settings, you can extract from the mailbox slack space, which is what gives us the all items, the recoverable items, the top of information store. This gives us every part of it, and that's why that's also part of the best practice workflow, is being able to grab everything and then deselect and get things out of our view as we decide that they're either duplicative or they're irrelevant. Store binary is here as well. So if you've assessed the data as being volatile, that is, it has user contact, let's go ahead and do the store binary. So it's the same kind of settings that you have in Workbench, but you can replicate them here and expand this and automate this with the director. I'll show you, just want to show you one more important thing here is when you go into Director to process data, there is a unique area where you go to use Exchange Web Services. Instead of just browsing, let's say, a file system, or maybe even browsing a file system for an Exchange database, in this case, you can enter your account, all of your account credentials here, and you can decide if you're going to select the mailbox or the archive for processing. So Director is the great tool to use when the case inevitably expands in the cloud and we have to collect more stuff and then produce it. So that's kind of the full eDiscovery workflow. Once we've attached to that mailbox, process the data, now we can do our web review and furthermore use Director to help out with that perfect workflow.
Well, and it seems like a lot of these same features would really add value when aggregating data from outside of the Office 365 environment. If your investigation leads you in that direction, it makes it easy to standardize and automate, accelerate that process. Michael, we have just a couple more minutes left before the top of the hour. Thank you for your time today. I appreciate both the technical detail and then some of the background about why this is a challenge and some of the pitfalls our clients might want to consider. One of, as we move into sort of final thoughts, of course, open for questions from the audience. One of the things I wanted to make sure that we talked about, Michael, sort of a wrap up on this is, just ensuring defensibility during this process, because there are a lot of ways you can technically do things, but it's important from a legal perspective to talk about what is defensible to regulators and the court of law. Could you, as we wait for questions from the audience, talk to us just a little bit about defensibility of this process?
Yeah, so you think about this API that they provide us, and it is what it is, right? It's what we get to use, and honestly, it's a lot better than many other cloud platforms. Many cloud platforms do not offer any API. So getting data produced can be troublesome, worrisome. So using the API, it is what it is, and the fact that Nuix can connect to it and store that binary at a time, in space, which is an immutable and defensible copy of those items is very, very powerful. The binary data is absolutely sound and can be produced in its native format or in things like relativity load files. So all of the Nuix goodness that we have around high-speed exports is available as well. So that's something to consider. I did talk about volatility as a very, very important part about when you do this. I did talk to one of our attorneys quite a bit about this, and we had a spirited argument, and he concurred that it's absolutely defensible in almost every case. He did mention that in some evolving cases where criminality starts to become a problem, where you're looking at more of a forensic investigation, when you're looking at case scrutiny that may be much higher, where reasonableness may change, proportionality may change. That's where we see that this may become questioned by some, plaintiff counsel, if you will. So some of the prosecutor types might say, well, this isn't a load file like an EO1 file, which our Imager product can create, or an LO1 file, something that came out of a product like Guidance or FTK. But we would be able to probably successfully argue that, well, this is what they give us. This is the API that's used to do this and produce this data. And with the Nuix chain of custody capability and the statistical analysis we do and the reporting we can produce, it tends to be a moot point. But it is something to think about. The volatility and all this technology, it's always something to think about and argue about and see where the trend is going. But I guess that's just a good way to close, is that what we've shown you today in both demonstration and conversation is that we're highly defensible in how we do it. We have some unique approaches for both speed and scalability and defensibility, and all the Nuix capability can be brought to bear on the collection of Office 365 information.
Well, I always like to remind our corporate clients from a defensibility perspective that Nuix is also a tool with a great market penetration into law enforcement, regulators, both the state and local level and the federal level here in the United States and internationally. So, when organizations like the Securities and Exchange Commission can publicly state that they leverage Nuix for majority of their eDiscovery, that gives you a certain level of confidence in its defensibility in the courts. Michael, thank you today again for walking us through this. As organizations move into a cloud email environment, it is important to consider both the transition process as well as how you will recover that information when somebody comes knocking with a court order, particularly as you do business globally and navigate across multiple jurisdictions. One of the great things that I like about what Michael described is Nuix's ability to locate in a regional center and achieve really high processing speeds, and I think that helps our clients mitigate some of the discovery risks of their technology strategy. So, Michael, thank you again for your time today, and thank everybody who joined us for 60 minutes on their Thursday. I hope you all have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, guys.